Thanks so much for organising this talk. Thanks so much for coming along. You're obviously highly intelligent to give up your Sunday afternoon to come out here. So I wanted to sort of spell out for you what we understand by libertarianism. Now, you'll all be familiar with the political party in this country called the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party has very sound founding principles. If you go back to see what Robert Menzies was saying in the 1940s and the 1950s when he set up the Liberal Party, they're very similar to what we stand for. There were differences, but he was very big on free speech, small government, low taxes, pro-free enterprise, deregulation, all these good things. Sadly, what has happened in the last generation is that the Liberal Party all around the country, with very few exceptions, it has become taken over by careerists and opportunists and lobbyists. People who see this successful party, and it is a very successful party, they say, well, yeah, I can join that party and I can get something out of it for myself. And we should be in politics because we care about the next generation and the generation after that. So the Liberal Party, I really believe, has... Look, the true believers are losing pre-selections all around the place. Now, you've got a very good Liberal Party senator here in Queensland, Jared Rennick, who's very libertarian. He's just lost his pre-selection. Okay, this is not just happening to Jared Rennick, it's happening all around the country. And so now, but there are differences between the Libertarian Party and the Liberal Party. Now, one of those key differences is that the Liberal Party, in its founding philosophy, does believe that we are much better off with a small government. So do we. And if you look, the 20th century was really a battle between communism and capitalism. And communism, of course, is the biggest government of all, 100% government. And, you know, killed 100 million people in the process. And the free enterprise countries around the world have basically had human prosperity, and that is good. Look at little Hong Kong and little Singapore, little specks of land, very low taxation rates, very pro-free enterprise, and absolutely booming, okay? And we believe that can happen all around the world, where the government gets out of the way and the people flourish. But the people like the Liberal Party and people like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who we admire very much, they still do believe that the government is fundamentally a good thing, it just needs to be kept small. The Libertarians believe that at best the government is a necessary evil because we know that it can grow and it always will want to grow. And it attracts people who want to sort of get messiah complexes. They want a big powerful state so they can be on top. Now, so that is, Libertarians think, look, the government consists of two major groups. When we talk about the state, the government, 99.9% of people who are the government are bureaucrats. Okay, they're people who get appointed to a job and they've got an incentive to make the government big and bigger. The other 0.1% are the politicians, who often are bad, but they can be a restraint on the size of the government. So now I sort of imagine in my mind, imagine if you're a young, bright kid, you're 35, you live in Canberra, you're on $150,000 a year, you're married with 2 kids, you've just had your 3rd kid, you want to be a lifelong public servant, and your wife is saying to you, we need a bigger house, we need more money. So that person will be driving to work and he's thinking, okay, well, I've currently got 6 staff under me. If I can have 12 staff under me, I'll get a bigger salary and I can buy the bigger house, keep the wife happy. This happens at a granular level. So that person is then going to set out on a plan. They're going to sort of get stories into the media. Look, there's this big problem over here, and the answer is a bigger government. And then they'll sort of talk to their seniors in the public service. They'll say, look, we do need a bit more funding to address this problem. And it could be a long-term plan, but then they'll end up with 12 employees under them rather than 6. They've all got an incentive to make the government bigger and bigger and bigger. It used to be the case when I was growing up that there was a trade-off if you worked for the public service. It used to be you had job security, but you got paid a bit less than the private sector. That is no longer the case. You still got the job security as a bureaucrat. They're getting paid extremely well, more with state governments, federal governments, and it's happening all around the world. So as Jill mentioned, I do encourage you to keep an eye on what's happening in Argentina. Argentina and Australia, 100 years ago, were twins, southern hemisphere countries, resource-rich, basically a European country with all the migrants. And Argentina had fantastic government, it was booming. Now, for 80 years, it's been on a very steady slide down into hell because of big government. It'll be like, when I got back from Argentina, people asked me what it's like. I said, well, look, I said, you know, we had Gough Whitlam running this country for 3 years, and his big plan was to make, Canberra bigger and bigger and bigger, okay? But we got rid of him after 3 years. But I say, imagine if Gough Whitlam had been running Australia for 80 years. That's Argentina. And it's an absolute mess. It's tragic to see. You can tell the place was once very rich when I was there, but it's now, it's in decay. But they've got this magnificent leader. Now, he's not like a Ronald Reagan or a Margaret Thatcher who just wants to keep the government small. Okay, but it's still fundamentally a good thing. He knows that the government will always find a crisis to grow. So even when Thatcher and Reagan say we want to, they did make the government a lot smaller. And England and America boomed as a result of that, and it was great. But then crisis has come along, and the government always says to us, oh, look, we just need a temporary increase in the size of the government. And it never shrinks. Now, I would like to say something about the second best state in Australia, Queensland, where all of my family lives. And except I'm the lone New South Welshman. Now, I believe that there is a way that we can truly help Queensland fulfil its potential to be the California of Australia. Now, what do I say? That's California of the old day, not California today, which has gone down the drain. But California used to be the golden state for a century. Okay, it was booming. Silicon Valley, Hollywood, all these used to be the place to go. Now, I know it's gone to hell now, but Queensland can be a truly great state. And I would like to open up a discussion today about correcting a mistake that was made in 1921 in this state. And that is when, against the will of the people, Queensland, the Labor government, of course, abolished the upper house. And I want to tell you why that's important. Because we believe that governments will eventually end up as tyrannical, we believe in the separation of powers, and it's important. Now, people think that the Greeks were the ones that kicked off the democracy, and they did, but their democracy was very, very simple. It was the Romans right next door in the Italian peninsula, who for 400, Jerry Hoogland knows all this, the Romans had a very, very sophisticated political system, a very complex democratic system, and they had the separation of powers. They had the Senate, and they had the Assembly of the People. And they had magistrates, and it was a good system because they said, look, we don't want a king, we don't want a tyrant, we've got to separate the powers between groups, okay? Now then we had, the Roman Empire, which was a dictatorship, and the Dark Ages, the medieval ages, but then we get to England in the 1600s, and they had a few civil wars, they killed the king at one point. But by the 1680s, England has stumbled into this, what we now call the Westminster system, where the king would have a bit of power, the House of Commons would have a bit of power, and the House of Lords would have a bit of power. But the English didn't really sort of set out to do that. That's just what they ended up with. And it's turned out to be a very good system of government. Now, then a generation later, there was a very smart French political theorist called Montesquieu, who looked across the channel, saw what the English had accidentally fallen into, and they said, look, this is really great. We need to have, it's a very good idea to have the separation of powers if we want to avoid a tyranny, which of course we all want to avoid a tyranny. So Montesquieu wrote books about and papers about, look, the separation of powers is critical. And the Americans come along at the end of the 1700s and they write the world's best constitution. And it is, the US Constitution very strictly says, we're going to have the House of Representatives, we're going to have the Senate, we're going to have the President, we're going to have the judiciary. And that was a good thing. And now when the colonies of this continent started to have democratic elections, and I think in this state it was in 1860, we had the Queensland Legislative Assembly and we had the Queensland Legislative Council. And that was all, and that's every other state in this country has the same thing. Now then what happened was you had a Labor government first got elected in 1915. And Labor governments, Labor at the time were openly socialists. They called themselves Christian socialists. A lot of them were genuine churchgoers, but they really believed, this is before the Bolsheviks had gone and killed millions of people, but they genuinely believed socialism is the way of the future to lift the poor up. Didn't work, but that's what they sincerely held it. And they thought the Legislative Council is a handbrake on our plan to make the government really big and powerful, because they wanted a big, powerful government to boss us all around, to be central planners. So the Labor Party comes in here in 1915 for the first time, and the first thing they want to do is they want to abolish the Legislative Council. They said, we don't want we don't want the separation of powers. We want to grow the state. And but to pass that law, they had to get the Legislative Council to agree to it. And so the Legislative Council in Queensland rejected it. And then they rejected it again. So then the Queensland Labor government said, well, let's put it to the people. Should we abolish the Legislative Council? And there was a referendum in this state. And the people of Queensland, by about 62%, which is a thumping majority, said, no, thank you very much, Labor Premier. We want to keep our Legislative Council. That's the only time the people of Queensland have been asked whether you want to keep a Legislative Council. That wasn't going to stop the Labor Party. So they then said, I think they had a friendly governor at the time, or they twisted his arm, and they got the governor to appoint more Labor Party mates to the Legislative Council. And it became known as the suicide chamber, because once they had a majority in there, they said, yes, we're going to abolish ourselves. That's what happened. And now what has happened since then in Queensland? You've really had, if we're going to be a democracy, it is a healthy thing to do to have a change of government from time to time. Okay? We don't want a one-party state, do we? Even under a democracy. Keeps the parties on their toes if there's going to be a change of power. Queensland, since you abolished the Legislative Council, you've really only had 3 periods of government. Labor was in from 1915 without a break until 1957. We were, that's right. Now then you had a National Party government from 1957 to 1989. And then since then, you've basically had Labor governments. Now we had the magnificent Campbell Newman give it a red hot shot. And we had Mr. Borbidge there in the 1990s. The problem with having only one chamber running the joint is that they control the bureaucracy to a very large extent, and they can sort of, manipulate things so that one party keeps winning. And that's where we find ourselves. Now, I think that Queensland's potential would be far greater if we had a restraint on the Legislative Assembly and we brought back the Legislative Council. It would, of course, be fully democratically elected. And I think now, when I've raised this with people, they say to me, well, look, it's a good idea in theory, John. How do we bring it about? And I've thought about that question. And of course, this is just friendly advice from a Southerner, but it's from someone who genuinely loves Queensland. And I was thinking about it. You know that the Queensland Greens, who we're not fans of, who our party, you could not ask for a more polar opposite of the Greens. But they support a Legislative Council in Queensland. Pauline Hanson's a significant person in this state. She supports the Legislative Council coming back. Now, that's an odd coalition. And I think that Richard, just to suggest it, Richard say, there we go, the Libertarian Party in Queensland also supports the return of the Legislative Council. So I was thinking, and I think the Katter Party probably would. I think there'd probably be one or two other little parties out there that would say yes. And I think how we could bring it. The problem with arguing this is if you've got if a party's in opposition and they're fairly confident they're going to win the election, the last thing they want to do is they say, well, we're about to come to power. We want to do all these good things, so we don't want to worry. We don't want to have a handbrake on our power. So that's why they don't talk about it. Right? How can we get an opposition in this state to say, or the government? We only need one major party to support it. Because I think the people of Queensland will support it. If we make the case, we've got to make the case intellectually. I think what we could do, we could have a compact between the various minor parties, including the Greens, including us, including One Nation, Katter and others, and we could say that as a bloc, for one election, we will preference either of the major parties, but 100% is committed to bringing back the Queensland Legislative Council. And one of those major parties is just going to say, gee, well, I can win the election with all those preferences from all those parties. Now, to get that debate happening, we've got to start writing opinion pieces. We've got to be talking about it on Talkback Radio. We've got to be passing motions at our parties. And now then we need to convince the people. They were convinced 100 years ago, but a superficial criticism will be, oh, we don't want more politicians. We've got to beat that argument because the truth is, as I said before, the government is 99.9% of them are bureaucrats who are appointed. The 0.1% are the politicians. Now, most politicians are pretty useless. Yes, I agree with that. Okay, but we can get some who will say, make the case for limiting the size of the government. So we need to say, look, if you want to have a more democratic government, if you want to return to the Westminster roots, which the rest of the English-speaking world lives under reasonably successfully, more successful than other parts of the world, we need to bring back the Queensland Legislative Council. So I will leave that point with you, and I hope that can be the beginning of a discussion in this great state. Thank you.